I'm Larry Weeks, and this is Bounce.
And that's actually a hopeful thing because we can learn to change the way we think. And if you change the way you think, you can change the way you feel. When you're upset, most of the time, the thoughts that upset you will be distorted. They're a fraud. It's a con. It's illogical. When you're depressed or anxious, you don't realize you're fooling yourself. The thoughts seem as valid and as accurate as the fact that there's skin on your hands. You don't realize that you're fooling yourself so tremendously when you're experiencing depression and anxiety. So every theory of every psychologist is false. All the biological theories of psychiatrists are false. We don't know the cause of depression and anxiety, so the idea that you'd have to go into the past to get at the true causes is fraudulent.
On this episode of the podcast, I'm very excited to be interviewing Dr. David Burns. He's a psychiatrist and pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And for those of you who may not be familiar with CBT, CBT is a psychotherapy based on the cognitive model, the way an individual perceives or thinks about a situation in the CBT model is more closely connected to the reaction than the situation itself. So CBT, as I understand it, aims to help people become aware of when they're making a negative interpretation, then develop alternatives or alternative ways of thinking. Dr. Burns wrote a book in the early 80s called Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy, which has sold more than 5 million copies worldwide, and is the most frequently recommended book for depressed individuals by both the American and Canadian mental health professionals. And personally, in the early 90s, I came across this book when I was at a very, very low point in my life. I had a contract to teach in Nagoya, Japan, and because of a series of events, the main one being a relationship that went south and ended, I wound up not going, but I had sold all my possessions, so I wound up in another city with no job, no prospects for a job. It was in the middle of the worst recession since the 80s up until that time. And I was I was doing odd jobs just to get by. At one point I picked up dead fish. That was a job. There were these lakes that had an event called Fish Kills where there would be runoff from the lawns and all these dead fish would float to the top, and they would hire people. And I was one of them that would go out on boats and just skim off these dead fish. It was probably the worst job I ever had. But anyway, I was just very low point. And some other things happened. So it was a cascade of events. And I could not muster a positive thought. I couldn't even get to neutral. And I wasn't suicidal, but it was bad. And then I came across this book, and through the book, I learned how to put my thoughts on paper and figure out what I was telling myself. But before the book, I thought it felt like thoughts were just runaway trains that you had no control over. At least it felt that way. And learning how to put these thoughts on paper to figure out what I was telling myself, which was mostly very bad and predictive and had no basis in truth, I was then able to dispute those thoughts and using some of the techniques and methods that we're going to talk about in a bit. But so it enabled me to kind of get back to kind of neutral, not thinking negative thoughts, and start being more positive. And through this process, I was then able to start a business that really kind of turned things around for me at the time. So I'm very excited to talk to Dr. Burns because of my personal connection with the book and some of these methods. But Dr. Burns is not only wrote this book, but it looks like about 8 other books, including Intimate Connections, The Feeling Good Handbook, 10 Days of Self-Esteem. There are many books. So he is also the visiting scholar at the Harvard Medical School, and he's acting chief of psychiatry at the Presbyterian University of Pennsylvania Medical Center in Philadelphia. He currently offers free psychotherapy training, and his weekly seminars are at Stanford. And he's been named Teacher of the Year by the graduating psychiatric residents at Stanford on 3 occasions. Wow. So he also has a podcast called The Feeling Good Podcast, available on iTunes. And he has many other resources at feelinggood.com. So without further ado, let's get to it. Dr. Burns, or is it Dr. David? What should you like to be called?
Oh, you can call me David or Dr. Burns. That's what I always said when I had patients, and some of them want you to be Dr. Burns, and some of them want you to be David. So okay. Whatever you want to call me is fine.
I'll use Dr. David. So welcome to the show. Good to have you.
Good to be on your show. Thank you, and good luck with your show. It's an exciting new enterprise for you. I hope it's a huge success.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. So define, before we get into some of the book, define CBT for us. What is cognitive therapy really?
Okay. First, I have to say I'm not a cognitive therapist and don't do CBT. So we have something new now called Team CBT, which is kind of like cognitive therapy on steroids. But the question is still a good one. CBT is there are 3 basic ideas behind it, and they go back at least 2,000 years to the teachings of the Greek philosopher Epictetus, who said people are disturbed not by things, but by the events, not by things or events, but by the views we take of them. It's the way we think about things that creates all of our emotions, positive or negative. And that idea also probably goes back even 500 years earlier to the time of Buddha, 2,500 years ago. But that's the first idea, and it's such a basic idea and so simple and obvious that very few people really grasp it or understand.
They think they know it, or they think they get it.
Well, or it just goes in one ear and out the other. It sounds like, what are we talking about? But an extreme example, and perhaps one that's politically offensive to people, is we often say, well, events upset us, not just the thoughts that we have. And people say, well, suppose you were dying of cancer, then it's certainly going to be that event and not some interpretation that you have to make before you could get, depressed or anxious or whatever. And in my workshop, my latest workshop, which is on trauma, I actually give an example of a woman I saw in the University of Pennsylvania hospital, a very sweet woman from the administration and the medical school, and she was the kind of woman who loved to help people, and she'd never married, but she was helping 3 relatives that lived with her in this big old house outside of Philadelphia, and she went for a 6-month OBGYN. And the doctor said, there's a lump here in your pelvis, and we want you to come in for a biopsy. She went into the University of Pennsylvania hospital, and they did a biopsy and said she had terminal ovarian cancer, and that there was just no effective treatment, at least at that time, and she would have about 2 years to live. And she understandably became extremely depressed, and a colleague said, would you see her? And because they know that I was into this new, at the time, cognitive therapy, and thinking maybe that could help her. And so I went to her bedside, and she was a very sweet woman, but severely depressed. I gave her a depression test that I was using at the time, and then I asked her, would you want some help with your depression? And she said, absolutely. I don't want to spend the last 2 years of my life, depressed and feeling worthless. And so I pulled out something called the daily mood log, and essentially you just have the person indicate all their emotions and how strong they are and what their thoughts are. And she was feeling 90% depressed and 100% guilty and 100% anxious and a lot of other negative emotions. And she had three thoughts. And one was, I'm letting my family down. Number two, they won't be able to survive without me. And number three, it's my fault that I got cancer. And those thoughts, rather than the actual cancer, is what's causing her emotional distress. And that's actually a hopeful thing, because we can learn to change the way we think. And if you change the way you think, you can change the way you feel. And that's a second basic idea of cognitive therapy, that there's tremendous power in our thoughts. And then the third idea is that, and this is one of the weirdest things that I thought was amazing when I first learned about cognitive therapy, is that when you're upset, most of the time, the thoughts that upset you will be distorted. They're a fraud. It's a con. It's illogical. Like depression is the world's oldest con. And if you look at this sweet woman's thoughts, they're very distorted. I have in my book, Feeling Good, the 10 most common, I call them cognitive distortions. And one of them is self-blame. And she's blaming herself for the cancer. And then she's doing what's called mind reading. She's assuming, my family is angry and lets down, feeling let down. That seems extremely unlikely. And then she has hidden should statements. I should always help others. I should never need help from others. And distortions like this. And it's really neat, because often you can quickly help someone correct these distortions, change these thoughts, and break out of a depression. In her case, it only took about 20 minutes, and her depression completely disappeared.
So it's bad enough, the cancer diagnosis, but she piles on top of it all of these other, as you said, distortions, and that's making her feel worse about the thing that she needs energy to cope with.
Yeah, and most of us do this to ourselves, that we're not aware of it. I do a lot of treatment for mental health professionals, and most of them are as anxious as can be, and their minds are flooded with negative thoughts, like I should be smarter than I am. I should be able to help most of my patients. I'm a bad mother. I'm a bad father. All of these self-critical, distorted thoughts. But when you're depressed or anxious, you don't realize you're fooling yourself. The thoughts seem as valid and as accurate as the fact that there's skin on your hands. You don't realize that you're fooling yourself so tremendously when you're experiencing depression and anxiety.
Yeah, I think I was telling you that your book in the early 90s really helped me out. One of the things that, and I told you this before we started, was this. I had no idea. I thought that because the thoughts were so automatic that it was kind of some organic thing that I couldn't control. And it wasn't until your book, because I'd never experienced this before. It wasn't until your book that I was able to put them on paper and start realizing, well, wait a minute, what am I thinking? And is this true? Kind of disputing. But I didn't know that prior to reading your material. So it was.
Yes, it's mind-boggling. I had the same experience when I first heard about this new approach that Aaron Beck had developed at Penn. I was doing research, brain research. I'd finished my residency, and I was researching this so-called chemical imbalance theory, which, by the way, has never been any evidence for it. It's actually not.
I was going to ask you about that.
No, it's just something that's been drug companies push for financial reasons, but that is not the cause of depression, I don't believe. But at any rate, I was doing research, and I was supposed to stay on the medical school faculty full time doing brain research. I had a grant from the federal government to develop a brain chemistry research laboratory at the medical school.
Interesting.
But I was giving out these pills, antidepressants, so-called antidepressants, by the bucketful, and I saw very few people who were recovering or being cured of depression. And then I heard from the department chairman that there's this guy who has this new idea that negative thoughts cause depression, and you can train patients to think differently. And I thought, that is such bullshit. It sounds like Norman Vincent Peale's Power of Positive Thinking.
It does, yeah.
And so I just decided to go to his weekly seminar and try it with some of my patients just to satisfy myself that it was baloney. And lo and behold, the patients, and I tried it with my most difficult patients that I was really stuck with, and they suddenly started to turn the corner on depression. They said, will you teach us more of these techniques? This is fantastic. And they drew me into it. And I said, wow, this is some fantastic thing. I had really underestimated it. And I sent the money back for my 5-year grant and said, I don't want to.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, I don't want to spend my life doing research on something that I know is false. I want to spend my life doing something that's valid and exciting.
Well, did your book? I'm just postulating, but did your book popularize? And that's the poor word, but did your book get CBT into the kind of the cultural jet stream of?
Yeah,
okay.
That's the thing that did it, but it didn't happen right away because after I finally got the book published, which was practically impossible, then my editor called me, just before it was published, and said, by the way, 90% of our books fail, and we gamble on the 10% that we make our money on, and so the president of the company makes a failure list of the books that we expect to fail, and then the company will now support those books, and your book is number one on our failure list.
Wow.
And so if you ever want to get any marketing or radio or anything like that, you're going to have to do it entirely on your own. And so it took me 8 years before I finally got on a national TV show.
Wow.
And then it went to the number one position within 5 minutes of the end of that show. But there were 8 years of just, scraping along. They'd print a few thousand copies, it would sell out. They'd print a few thousand more, it would sell out. Then when I finally got national television exposure, it exploded just less than overnight, exploded within 5 or 10 minutes.
That's pre-Oprah, right? But who was that?
Yeah, it was Phil Donahue show.
Phil
that
Donahue.
was the
well, that's
big
just
thing.
As good, I guess. Right?
Yeah. It was like syndicated at like 287 markets. It was like what I'd had before that was like the difference between a fly and a tank.
He's the guy.
Blew everything away. It taught me the power of media and the power of television.
Well, that's great. Was Ellis, and I don't want to sidetrack this, but Albert Ellis a contemporary of yours, or was he?
Well, he was older. I mean, I'm old now. I'm like 75 in September, but he was old a long time ago. He was way older than me. But he was the guy who really got the whole thing going in the 1950s and 1960s in New York. And I just loved Albert Ellis. He was a kind of a kook. He was a wild guy, crazy guy, but he's
very frank.
Very frank, very honest. That's why I admired him, because he had integrity and he didn't steal ideas from other people and call them their own, the way so many people do in our field. And that's why I really admired him. And then, so whenever I would give workshops, I would always say positive words about Albert Ellis, and then it would get back to him. You've got this fan, David Burns, who's singing your praises when he does workshops, and he was very narcissistic, so he loved that. And so he decided I was a good guy, and so we had a really
He's very
nice
self-accepting of himself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very, very accepting.
So you had you kind of mentioned it. You kind of had this conversion experience when it came to effective therapy methods, right?
Yeah.
And how much significance should one put on one's either past or childhood? Is there still room for? I mean, is that fruitful to explore in trying to overcome anxieties, depressions, and what have you?
Sure. Well, I would have to say yes or no. We have something new now called Team CBT, which is a super high-speed way of treating people. And it's kind of like the CBT I developed, but it has a motivational front end on it. You might say that I've discovered techniques to melt away therapeutic resistance the first time I sit down with someone. And so when I'm no longer in practice, but I still treat tons of people for free.
And is Team CBT, is that on your website as well?
Yeah, that's what feelinggood.com is all about, new Team CBT.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah, and so essentially, when I treat someone now, it's generally in a workshop or in one of my training groups at Stanford, or I take people on Sunday hikes too, and I treat them, as we're hiking along, generally people in our training groups. But usually I can complete a course of psychotherapy in one session now, and it has to be 2 hours, but I can go from start to finish. And I would say the 50 of the last people I've treated have pretty much all recovered in one session. Then you have to do a little follow-up, a little relapse prevention training. But the point is, now I'm doing trauma workshops. So most of the people that I'm treating have had horrific trauma. Some of them beginning with sexual abuse in childhood, and many of them have had trauma all the way through their lives, various kinds of trauma. And I treat them, how are you feeling at this moment, right now? Because all of those past wounds are embodied in their distorted thinking in the here and now. And so, sometimes we might go back and do something called memory rescripting to visualize a traumatic event and then go back and punish the offender or something like that. But usually I'm amazed that even those kinds of things aren't necessary, because as soon as the symptoms disappear in the here and now, the person just goes into a kind of euphoric state, and then the therapy is essentially done. Just going into the past to explore the past can be very unproductive. And the fact is, we don't know the cause of depression or anxiety. All we can say with certain is that all current theories can be proven false. So every theory of every psychologist is false. All the biological theories of psychiatrists are false. We don't know the cause of depression and anxiety. So the idea that you'd have to go into the past to get at the true causes is fraudulent, because it implies that someone knows the causes that happened in the past. We don't know to what extent it's genetic, to what extent it's environmental. All we can say for sure is that we've got some fantastic and now super high-speed treatment techniques, which is good news. One day we'll know the cause, but now we don't know the cause, and people find this hard to accept or hard to grasp. But before we knew the cause of, say, epilepsy, there were hundreds of theories and hundreds of quack treatments based on all of these theories. And then when the cause of epilepsy was discovered, then all of that stuff went down the drain. And the same with polio. Before we knew the cause, people had all these theories that they believed in.
So just to park there for a second. So yeah. CBT says our thoughts cause our feelings, and if we address those thoughts, our feelings will improve. You're saying you don't know the cause of, you're saying you don't know all of the causes of depression?
Well, there's a difference. And see, the theory you just said, I tested that at the Stanford Hospital. What are the circular causal connections between negative thoughts and negative feelings? And I showed for the first time that negative thoughts actually do have a causal effect and create negative feelings, and then the negative feelings generate more negative thoughts. But here's the question. See, that's the physiology of depression. That's not the pathology of depression. The question is, why do some of us have so many more negative thoughts?
Oh, the automatic thoughts that come up.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, because some people are just kind of happy all the time. You see what I mean? I've known people who will say, I've never had an unhappy moment in my life. And others who were kind of chronically negative from early childhood.
Have you read any of Sam Harris's writings where he talks about, he says there's really no free will. In a sense, his thesis is your thoughts, you can't control. There's some kind of unconscious process where these things come up. Is that what you're addressing to some degree? These automatic thoughts, where they originate, or
well, we don't know where they originate. Why some people are on this negative kind of negative bent, and some people are very happy. About 30 years ago, and I should have kept this reference. I kept it for a while, but I saw an article that came out on shy dogs. It was very interesting, and shy dogs have what's called homophobia. That's not homosexuality phobia. It's fear of Homo sapiens, fear of humans. Mm-hmm. And there are these pointer dogs that when they're born, they have intense fear of humans from the moment they're born. If they see a human, they'll go and shiver and hide, and their tails between their legs, and they look like they're in a state of terror. And then other of the same breed, the moment they're born, they see a human, they rush over to it and want to lick you, and they're in love with you. And that was shown to be a single gene that separated these. And that was like a shyness model that was entirely genetic. With no environmental influences. And Albert Ellis, he used to say that he thinks that like even perfectionism is totally genetic. Like you're born with these negative thinking patterns, and that could very well be the case. But my goal has always been on high-speed recovery, high-speed cure, whatever you call it. For example, blood phobia is thought to be 100% genetic, the fear of blood. And when I wrote my book, When Panic Attacks, I counted up all the phobias and anxiety disorders that I've personally had, and I realized I've had 17 anxiety disorders. It's why I love to treat anxiety, because whatever the patient has had, I say, oh, I've had that too, and I know how sucky that is, and I can lead you out of the woods, and what a joy it's going to be. But one of the ones I had was blood phobia growing up, and it was probably genetic.
Wow.
My mother had fears.
And you're a doctor, yeah.
Yeah, and it was terrible, because the day in medical school we had to draw blood out of each other's arms. I dropped out of medical school for a year.
Oh, did you?
I said I don't want to be a doctor. This isn't for me. But I eventually went back. But I got over it in the emergency room of Highland Hospital in Oakland. The first day I went up as an intern to work there, they brought in this horrible trauma case. A fellow bomber tried to blow himself up. He was going to blow up City Hall in Oakland, and his mom blew up in the basement.
Wow.
But he survived, and they were the police and paramedics. They were pushing him at high speed down the hall, and went into this major trauma room. And I was just terrified, because I was going to, have to confront blood. And this nurse grabbed me by the jacket and said, "You've got to help us." And I said, "Well, this isn't exactly my expertise." And she pulled me over to the door, and here there were like 6 or 8 doctors and nurses, and they were sticking needles into this guy's arms and legs and pushing fluids in with blood pressure cuffs. And she said, "You've got to help us." And I said, "Well, what exactly did you want me to do?" And she handed me a toothbrush, and she said, "You get busy with this." And I says, "What do you mean? The guy's got bad breath or something? He's on the verge of death, and you want me to brush his teeth?" And she says, "No, stupid." And she pulled me up to the body, and she said, "You see his tissue? It all has these black spots in it. Well, that's a gunpowder, and someone's going to have to scrub that out of his tissue, or he'll die of poisoning, and you're the one who's going to do it."
Wow.
And I had to take my hands and put it in this bloody tissue, his chest, over his ribs, and scrape this black gunpowder pieces out of his tissue. And he was in a coma, so he couldn't feel it. I mean, it would have been torture beyond imagination. But I was in a state of panic on a 0 to 100 scale, it was like 100. And I couldn't say, "Oh, well, tomorrow's going to be a better day. I've got to leave right now." I had to stay there.
You're forced to confront it.
Yeah, and confront my fear. And 15 minutes into it, I suddenly had the thought, this is just a county hospital, but these doctors and nurses are mind-boggling. They're so good at what they're doing. They're probably going to save this guy's life. And I'm a small part of this medical team. And 30 days from now, when I finish this month, I'm going to be a real doctor. And when that hit my head, I couldn't believe it. And my anxiety went to 0. And I was cured. And that was one of the best months of my life, working with trauma cases. And if I hadn't been dedicated to going into psychiatry at that point, I think I would have been a trauma surgeon or an ER doctor. But the point I'm trying to make is, here's my totally genetic problem, and it was cured in 20 minutes without medications.
So that's very interesting. That is a great story. So you're saying you've had multiple phobias. That happened to be one, and a combination of kind of exposure to what you feared, but also that coupled with you reframed it or somehow changed your thinking. So let's talk about that real quick, because there are many people listening who have horrible anxieties or phobias. They won't leave their house, or So do you advocate a combination of some type of exposure therapy along with CBT or thought disputing? Or
well, those are 2 of 4 models that I use. I use I use the cognitive model, the negative thoughts that trigger anxiety. Like if you're going to give a talk, you think, I'm going to blow it, I'm going to screw up, everyone's going to laugh at me. Those are cognitions, negative thoughts, and you can challenge them with cognitive therapy techniques. I use the exposure model. Every anxious patient is going to have to confront their worst fear. By the way, I got over my last phobia 3 weeks ago. You know what it was? It was another one I've had since childhood.
Flying.
No, being in front of a camera. I could not smile.
Get out.
Like, hi, see, I can do it now.
That is really? That was
I would just get angry in front of cameras. I hated having my picture taken because when I was little, my sisters used to tease me because I had a crooked smile and I was goofy looking and I squinted in the sunlight. And so I've always had this phobia. But anyway, to come back.
Wait a minute. How did you get over that? How did you?
Well, it was
you're relaxed. You're fine.
See, I had to do some interviews, and then so I had to buy this Logitech camera, and the interviews seemed to go okay. And then I was playing around with it. It says, "Oh, if you want to take a picture, just click here." So I thought, well, I'll click here, and I smiled and took a picture. And then I looked at it, and I looked okay. I couldn't believe it. I thought I would look.
You're a very
goofy.
attractive man, Dr. Burns. You're very attractive. Well, that is a great
later on. I'm just pulling your leg.
That is a great story. Did you? So exposure to it. So let me ask you this: for people that
but it was also cognitive too, because you see, I had the belief I'll look terrible if I try to smile. For a camera. See, and then when I saw it, then I saw, oh gosh, that's a false belief. I didn't believe it anymore.
So you still practice this? You practice it on yourself, the CBT.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If it didn't work on me, I wouldn't have bought it. Yeah. My wife uses it. We use it. Our kids use it. That if you can't heal yourself as a therapist, then you're kind of a fraud to my way of thinking. But anyway, we're talking about these 4 models for anxiety. So those are 2 of the 4, and the third one is called the hidden emotion model. And that's this idea that most anxious people are exceptionally nice, and 80% of the time they have some problem that's bugging them in their life right now that they're not dealing with, like they're ticked off at somebody or they have some feeling they think they're not supposed to have, and they sweep it under the rug because they think they have to be so nice. And then it comes out indirectly as a panic attack or a phobia or chronic worrying. So that's another incredibly powerful tool I use. And then the fourth one is called the motivational model, that every anxious patient wants to be cured, but at the same time they'll fight against the cure because of magical thinking, which I call outcome resistance, as well as process resistance, which is the fear of exposure. And so I melt away the resistance before using any of these techniques. And keep in mind that my own blood phobia was also an example of the motivational model, because I had avoided blood for the first 28 years of my life. See, I had no reason to overcome the fear. But then I decided I would like to do an internship and residency and become a psychiatrist, because my life would be a lot better. Because after medical school, I also dropped out. I never really wanted to be a doctor. And my wife and I, we were actually homeless in Carmel Valley, California, and I would counsel people in coffee houses or on beaches for free. And they never took me seriously because, I wasn't a real, quote, mental health professional. And so that's why I decided to go back and do my internship and residency. And so I'd have a way to support myself and do the thing that I love to do. So at that point, I had a high motivation to overcome my fear of blood. And so you have to deal with those emotional variables, those motivational variables, as well as the anxiety itself.
Yeah, you've got to want to get better, right? You've got to have motivation seems to be key. Right.
Yeah, but it's even more than wanting to get better, because tons of people with anxiety will go to a psychiatrist, psychologist saying, I want to get better. but there is still this outcome resistance. Every anxious patient believes if my anxiety disappears, something terrible is going to happen. And if you don't address that, the patient will subconsciously fight the treatment.
Is phobia treated? Is phobia better cured, for lack of a better word, with a trained therapist versus working on your own? Can you fix a phobia like you did?
Well, definitely the evidence shows that you can do it for depression, 2/3 of people. And that's why I developed, Team CBT to say, how about the third who can't use this for depression? What's the problem there? And that's turned out to be an issue of resistance and motivation. And that's why I've kind of reshaped CBT into Team CBT. Now, there has been some research, perhaps not as much, but on anxiety disorders, and can people overcome them on their own without treatment? And the answer to that is some people definitely can, say by using exposure techniques. And certainly I've done it myself with a tremendous number of my own fears. I had horrible public speaking anxiety and performance anxiety and social anxiety, and I had the fear of blood and bees and horses and dogs, and I had a fear of vomiting and all kinds of things. So, but there's nothing wrong with going to a therapist if you need a little extra help. In my book, When Panic Attacks, is on all of the anxiety disorders, and a lot of people have written to me and say, "Wow, this book cured my anxiety." But there are probably many who read the book, but they need more help, and there's nothing wrong with that. One of my first phobias that I was cured of was my fear of heights, and a high school teacher actually helped me with that. He wasn't a shrink, but he knew how to overcome the fear of heights, and so that was the first phobia that I overcame. But sometimes I think it can be helpful to have a trusted therapist or a friend help walk you through one of these fears, if it's someone you really like or trust. But it has to be a therapist who's using the latest techniques and who isn't afraid of exposure. The problem is that the research has shown that 75% of American mental health professionals will not use exposure when treating anxiety disorders.
They're probably worried about risk of,
Yeah, it's a needless worry. It's a fantasy in their mind. They think the patient hypnotizes them into believing, "Oh, I'm not ready for exposure. I'm too fragile," and then the therapist buys into that, and then the therapy is doomed. And so, if you are going to a therapist for a form of anxiety, I would ask if the therapist uses exposure as well as other techniques in treating anxiety. And if they say no, I wouldn't go to them. And I would also ask the therapist, how long does the treatment usually take? For when we're working with people with anxiety disorders, we can usually complete the treatment in just 2 or 3 or 4 sessions in most cases.
Wow.
And if the therapist says, "Oh, we're going to go into your childhood and spend years on this," I'd say, "You're not the doctor I'm looking for." And I would also avoid doctors who use antidepressants and anti-anxiety agents as well.
So that's very interesting. So I'm assuming then you don't think, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is there at any point in someone's depression, let's say, or anxiety for that matter, would you recommend medication at all these days?
I wouldn't anymore, even though I started out as a full-time psychopharmacologist. But the psychotherapy techniques that I've developed with the help of my colleagues in my group at Stanford are very powerful. And it would be unusual that we would need to be adding a medication. Now, if someone has bipolar manic depressive illness, that's an organic brain disease, and that person is probably going to need some kind of mood stabilizer. Or if someone has schizophrenia, they're probably probably going to need, and they're hallucinating and hearing voices, and they become, psychotic, have episodes where they're fulminantly psychotic, they're probably going to need some medication too. So I've never been against medications. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're life-saving, but I think it's tremendously exciting that we have powerful techniques now that most people, if they find a therapist who knows these new techniques, can be treated quickly and effectively without medications.
Yeah, that's great. But would you do it in combination with CBT or some form of it?
When I was in clinical practice, now I wouldn't use them, at all. When I was in clinical practice, because the new research is kind of discrediting antidepressants.
But I mean, for bipolar, some of these other disorders.
Oh, for bipolar, yeah, I would still. I treated a lot of bipolar patients with cognitive therapy, but I always, if they had bipolar 1, where they would become fulminantly, bizarrely psychotic with their mania, yes, I would have them on lithium plus cognitive therapy, and that was about 50 times more effective than in the old days when I used drugs alone. I used to run the lithium clinic at the VA hospital in Philadelphia as a part of the medical school. And we had one of the 3 top psychopharmacology teams in the world there at Penn at the time. And I treated those veterans with state-of-the-art psychopharmacology, and they were going in and out of the hospital constantly. I never had one of them who had a good outcome, to be honest with you. Never one patient. And then when I learned cognitive therapy and added that to the psychopharmacology, in the next 25 years, I had only one patient who ever needed one hospitalization for one occasion, one bipolar, and all the rest did, including that individual, did beautifully without the need for hospitalizations. And I felt that the compassionate relationship and the cognitive techniques were much more powerful than the drug, but in conjunction with the drug, provided the best outcome. And part of the issue there is most bipolar patients had this perfectionism belief that they had to be great to be worthwhile. And that was a part of the mania. And developing unconditional self-esteem seemed to be a real game changer for them and allowed them to kind of relax and become warmer and more human and not have to go through those extreme mood swings. Oh. But it is a biological disorder. There's no doubt about it.
So you list in your book, Feeling Good, the 10 cognitive distortions that cause depression or some other mood disorder. All or nothing thinking, mental filter generalization. Some of them you mentioned earlier. Are there some that, is there a macro distortion that would cause the others that you would focus on first?
Well, there is. My 10 distortions, I once did what's called a factor analysis, which you say, what are the dimensions? How many truly independent things are there here? Or how many patterns are there? Mm-hmm. And it turned out there's only 2 patterns there. One of them is I'm no good, and the other is you're no good. And the I'm no good is like the depressive thinking, the all or nothing thinking. I'm a total failure, the overgeneralization, because I did a workshop yesterday for about a couple hundred clinical social workers here in this area. They were having their annual conference, and they kindly invited me to do a keynote address and a workshop. And I was talking about the negative thoughts of therapists, and one of the therapists there had some kind of altercation, I guess, with her daughter, and then she said, I'm a bad mother, and she started sobbing in the workshop. And then she said, I must be a fraud as a therapist as well, because I'm having a conflict with my daughter. And that's like overgeneralization, because she said, I'm actually a very effective therapist, but I'm telling myself I'm a fraud. But she's going from, I have this specific conflict with my daughter, to I'm a bad mother. And that's that kind of I'm no good, all or nothing thinking, self-blame, should statement, hidden emotional reasoning. I feel like a failure, so I must be one. That's the I'm no good thinking. And then the you're no good thinking are the thoughts that lead to anger and conflict in relationships with others, like, oh, he's a loser. All he cares about is himself. He shouldn't be like that. So all those 10 distortions can be directed at somebody else Instead of I'm a loser, I should be better, you're a loser, you should be different. And so those are the two macro concepts, if that's what you were referring to.
I was that. That's great. That's perfect, because there are a lot of distortions, and when you're trying to trace down what is the root of my distortion, that helps. I think that would help.
In a way, the 10 distortions are like 10 different ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's just like sometimes people will pick up on all or nothing thinking, and then they'll see it. And for other people, they'll pick up on mental filter or discounting the positive. It's like getting people where they're suddenly seeing something they weren't able to see before. And that's what the Buddha was trying to say 2,500 years ago. And he had over 100,000 followers. And I saw on TV, I'm no expert on Buddhism, but they said he had only 3 people who became enlightened during his lifetime. And I can understand it, because what he was saying is so simple, and it must have been frustrating for him that it's so simple people can't kind of see it.
Yeah, or don't think it's more complicated, so they'll pass it up. Yeah. They may see it and say, it can't be that simple or whatever.
People get enraged sometimes if you say it's simple. This is an insult. I think people think they've got, their problem is so large they need to go to Vienna and see some Freud. But at the same time, we say it's simple. I remember at the time I was occasionally, now it's kind of part of my thinking, but I really had to work at it. I had to write down. You do have to write it down.
And because the biggest, one of the challenges I had, Doctor, was the automatic thought. I couldn't figure out what was making me feel bad right away or soon after. And that was they were happening so fast at the time that I'm like, what is going on? And I drew that stick figure. You remember you had
that's cool that you used that.
You had an exercise.
You really did work at it. Way to go.
Just for the audience, there's an exercise. It's real simple. Get a piece of paper and a pen. And if you don't know why you're feeling sad, this helped me a lot. From Doc, you draw a stick figure and you put a bubble caption. And Doc, correct me if I'm wrong. You do a bubble caption above the stick figure, and then you ask yourself, why is the stick figure sad? And so for some reason,
you just make up negative thoughts.
Yeah, for some reason that worked. I would look and I could project and say, oh, it's this and that. So, little trick there.
You remember what you were telling yourself?
At the time, there was a lot of fortune telling. I was being predictive on the negative side. I was saying this will never. It was kind of a permanence, like this would never work out. This will never get better. The hopelessness. Yes. Yeah,
that's the worst part of depression. And the hopelessness is just another mental con, but you don't know it. And when you're feeling down, people listening to this podcast right now, well, not right now because it's not live yet, but when they listen to it, there'll be a lot of people who are feeling like, I really am a worthless human being. I'll be depressed forever. And it seems real to them. They don't realize you're fooling yourself. And then that thinking often leads to suicidal urges when you feel like there's no exit, that this pain will never end. We can put up with almost anything if we think it's going to end.
Yeah.
But there's something weird about depression that it cons you into thinking it will be like this forever. You're no good, and you'll always be no good, and your problems will never be solved. And it just seems overwhelmingly valid. I've had patients, and I wrote about this in Feeling Good, who used to say to me, Dr. Burns, I go to bed every night and I pray to God, please, God, give me terminal cancer. So I'll wake up dying of cancer, and that way I can die in dignity without having to kill myself.
Oh, man. I wonder if part of that is having something tangible versus in your head. You know what I mean? Like, give me something, give me a disease.
There's something very true about that, too, because I had plenty of patients I treated who had a terror of going bankrupt, and they would have anxiety attacks over this. It'll be so terrible. My wife won't love me, and I'll be homeless on the street, and everyone will be judging me, and it'll be so shameful. And of those patients, about 4 of them actually went bankrupt while I was treating them. Their worst fear came to pass, and every single one of them recovered on the day they went bankrupt. Their symptoms suddenly disappeared. For the reason you just said, it was real. And
it was worse in the head than in reality.
Yeah, because their wife didn't stop loving them. They didn't end up homeless on the street. All these fears, and they suddenly realized it's not realistic.
Wow.
Life goes on.
That's great. So you mentioned the two things, which is, and by the way, this is great, Dr. Burns. But I
love talking to you because of the effort that you put in, and the questions that you raise are, to me, very exciting questions.
This is so good, and a lot of this I didn't know. But you said the two, there's two macros. I'm no good, you're no good. So let's talk about the I'm no good in self-esteem, because I'm a little confused as to the views. How important is self-esteem, and how would you define it? And then I want to talk about Albert Ellis's views on self-esteem, because
his and mine are really the same thing. But,
are they? Okay.
You can look at it in many levels, but sometimes they'll take children in grammar school who are unpopular, being teased or bullied, or they're depressed, and say, well, you're worthwhile, special little girl, because you have beautiful eyes, or you have a beautiful singing voice, or they'll try to give the child something to be proud of. And that's called conditional self-esteem, where you find something about yourself to like. The problem with that is that it's as if you have to earn the capacity to be worthwhile. And furthermore, whatever you think you're good at, there's going to be somebody who's better at that, and you may lose that ability. Like if you have beautiful eyes, what happens if you go blind and you have to, your eyes get some disease, or which I've seen, or things like that. So then you can move up the ladder of enlightenment to unconditional self-esteem, and so here's where you love yourself because you need love, the same way you would love your child because the child needs love. Like I had this cat who came to our back deck, a feral cat who'd never had contacts with humans, but he'd been in a fight and his paw had swollen up as big as his head, and he forced himself to come to our kitchen door, and he held his paw up like, "Would you help me?" And so we captured him, had surgery done, saved his life. He was on the verge of death, and although he was paranoid and violent initially, he over time he turned into this very, very loving cat. But he wasn't special. See, he didn't have any special talent. He was covered with scars when he came to us. He had worms, fleas, ticks. He was emaciated. But he came to love me, and I came to love him. And when we were together, the heavens opened up. And he taught me that when you no longer need to be special, life becomes special. So you give up this idea that you have to have some special thing about you, and that's called unconditional self-esteem. Like if your child comes to you crying and hurt, you love your child. They don't have to earn it in some way. Then you get to a point where even that becomes a pain in the ass. And the question is, why do I need unconditional self-esteem? As soon as you got unconditional self-esteem, then my advice is put it in the toilet and flush it down the toilet. Get rid of it as fast as possible, because it's another perfectionistic pain in the ass. Why should you have to have unconditional self-esteem? You get rid of it. You see, I got rid of my self-esteem when I was jogging home from the train station in Philadelphia a number of years ago, and it kind of fell off as I was running. And then I thought, gosh, that's great. I don't have self-esteem anymore. Well, this feels fantastic. And I was able to run a little faster. And then a few more steps, my self fell off, and I had no identity, and that felt even greater. And now I have no self, no identity.
Now we're in Buddhism territory. Now we're in Buddhist territory.
Yeah. But you and I are in Buddhism territory because we're just having fun together. Mm-hmm. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Like we're not trying to be special or to be worthwhile. It's just a pleasure to meet you and to hang out and to shoot the breeze like this. And what a privilege and what an honor and what a wonderful way to spend an early afternoon.
We're not self-conscious.
Yeah. Exactly. And so then, there is no self. There is no self-esteem. These are just marketing terms, and once you see through them, there's a liberation. But it's not just a trick with words, because you see, I've been writing about this on my website as blogs and feelinggood.com, and I'm working on a draft now of one of, do we have a self that can be judged? Do you see, could you be more or less worthwhile as a human being? And that'll be the first blog. And then the follow-up one, do we even have a self in the first place? And although these are philosophical issues, they're practical. I was going on a hike. Like, I have these free training at Stanford on Tuesdays for Bay Area mental health professionals. They can have unlimited free training and unlimited free personal work and therapy in my Stanford training group on Tuesdays. They can also come to my Sunday hikes. They're about 3.5. You could come to a Sunday hike, meet at my house on Sunday morning at 8:30, and we go hiking with
cool.
people for about maybe 3.5 hours and do personal work. Well, a really neat woman, a psychiatrist actually in one of our training programs, came on the Sunday hike, and she was stuck with this patient that she's been seeing for 8 years or 18 years or some prolonged period of time. And I saw the errors that she was making in the treatment. She wasn't making the patient accountable. She was doing all the work. She was trying to help the patient. The patient kept yes-butting and resisting and wouldn't do homework, wouldn't get an agenda. And I pointed this out to her. But then the psychiatrist, who's a beautiful woman, a wonderful, tremendous human being and gifted and compassionate, she started sobbing because she thought I was criticizing herself, that she had a self that was being judged as not good enough. Do you see? But yeah. I wasn't. I was just saying, you're making errors, in my opinion, in your therapeutic techniques, and these are fairly easily correctable errors. But she was generalizing.
You were addressing the technique. She was addressing the self.
Yeah, that's right. And because she thought she had a self that wasn't good enough, it was very painful. Well, we worked that out and had a fantastic exchange and email exchanges, and it's going to lead to these blogs on my website. But it's a practical thing because,
very practical.
You know, if you think you have a self, you set yourself up for all kinds of
You're going to
pain.
be offended all the time, right?
Yeah, or angry, get defensively angry that someone criticized yourself. Who the hell do they think they are?
Well, I've never been guilty of that, so
or get depressed. Like in my workshop, it was a wonderful experience yesterday, and they kindly gave me a standing ovation at the end, which isn't always happen when I give a talk. So it meant a lot to me, and people came up, they were very enthusiastic. But I saw one or two people in the audience. One was a man who appeared very angry, and clearly I had said something that offended him. I have no idea what it is. Usually I get feedback, but this was set up to where the sponsoring organization got all the feedback, so I won't have any way of finding out. But he was clearly very annoyed with me, and maybe just the fact that I said that you can now get complete recovery with most people in a single therapy session, probably that enraged him, or something I said enraged him. But you see, for me, it just, I wish I knew what his concern was, and then I could find truth in it. We could dialogue about it, use that as a chance to develop a deeper relationship, perhaps. But in the old days, I would have been thinking, oh my gosh, she's criticizing myself. I'm not good enough. This is terrible. I get anxious, ashamed. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
You do see it.
But you were saying that, how did you get to that point? You were jogging, and you let go of the self, or
Well, that's not a technique that you can use.
I know. So is there a technique? How do are there techniques? How does one become less sensitive and drop the need for the self-esteem or the self per se?
Well, that's kind of what I'll be writing about. Talking about some of those techniques, but one of them is called Let's Be Specific. And you can do this on your own thinking, or when someone else is criticizing you. Like if someone were to say, "Oh, David, you're a crappy speaker," or something like that. and instead of getting defensive, I could say, well, gosh, I make a lot of mistakes in my teaching. Which ones did you notice? Give me something here to hang my hat on, and something to learn from. And there's a philosophy behind that we can have specific flaws, but how could we have a self that is flawed? Like, what's the definition of a worthwhile human being, or what's the definition of a worthless human being? And when you try to define those terms, you'll find that however you try to define them, it becomes nonsensical. For example, what's the definition of an inferior or worthless human being? How might a person define that? You want to take a stab at it?
They don't do anything or produce anything, don't have a job, or this is not me, by the way. I'm playing devil's advocate. Or they don't contribute.
Let's just take any one of those. Just say, let's just start, and then we'll do another one. But a worthless human being is someone who doesn't have a job.
Okay.
Is that the claim?
You know what? Let's not use that. How about
Jesus probably didn't have a job.
You're right. So that was too easy. I just threw a softball. How about what about a murderer, or what about somebody who steals? Or somebody who a criminal, for example.
Someone who does something illegal.
Yes.
Breaks the law.
Yes.
What percentage of human beings have broken at least one law on one occasion, say sped 5 miles an hour above the speed limit?
Oh.
What percentage of human beings have broken some kind of rule in growing up?
Yeah, the majority.
Yeah, probably just about everyone.
Yeah.
So we're saying all human beings are worthless?
No, we are not.
See, it becomes nonsensical. However you define these terms, you can show they apply to all human beings, or they apply to no human beings, or they're just nonsensical.
What about a murderer? What about somebody who commits murder?
Someone who kills another human being is worthless. So if you were working in a prison, say with some people who've been arrested, some people who've been arrested for murder, would you say to your people you were counseling, oh, by the way, I want you to know that you're a bad human being?
No, I want them to know that what they did was bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you say he's a bad human being, we already know that he killed somebody, and that sometimes we might even say that killing would be justified.
In fact, that could exasperate it if I convinced him he was a bad human being. He would say, well,
exactly.
I can't change.
Exactly.
Right.
That's what my research has shown, that blame is actually probably the major cause of nearly all relationship conflict, all marital conflict,
really?
Or with your partner, yeah. It's not the fact the other person's to blame, but the fact that you're blaming them. That's the mindset that leads to conflict in relationships.
That is interesting. And so this is great, and I've just got a few more questions. But there's so much here, and I really, man, it's fun. Yeah, this is great.
We're probably putting everyone to sleep, but we're wide awake.
No, man, as long as I'm enjoying it. Because I got so many other questions, but real quick. So let's talk about just one quick kind of role play application here. Let's say I'm an entrepreneur. I invest all my money in a startup, right, or whatever. I've spent years building it. It all goes under, and you mentioned somebody, there's some people that went bankrupt that you were talking to, or I could be an executive at a high flying company and lose my job or whatever. But let's say I'm going through that. So just as a practical application, now I have all these negative thoughts, and there are many, right? I'm depressed because I'm suffering loss. I feel rejected. I have some guilt because people depended on me. I've got anxiety because the future is uncertain now. I don't know, will I ever get back on my feet? I'm probably feeling powerless because I've been beaten down by all these circumstances. Maybe I'm lonely because I've also lost a relationship relationships through this this company going under, or what have you. So I'm just making up this scenario. What does that person do to bounce back? What mentally, lead us through just a couple of steps. I
won't do it as a self-help thing, because I think that's kind of cruel. A lot of times journalists want you to give 3 tips on depression, and it's bullshit to my way of thinking, but I'll show you how I would walk a person through it very, very, very quickly. First, in team therapy, we measure things at the start and end of every session. So if I'm working with that person, my goal is to try to cause their depression to disappear in today, the first time we sit down together, not 8 months from now or 3 years from now. So I'll measure the severity of depression, anxiety, suicidal urges, anger, things like that before the session begins. How are you feeling right now here in the waiting room? And then I'll look at it and I'll see exactly how upset the person is. Then I'll empathize for typically it would. And I have like a 2-hour session. I don't do this 50-minute session stuff because it makes no sense and it isn't effective. And since I treat everyone for free, I don't care how long the session lasts because I'm not getting paid anyway. So I'd say, well, just sit down until you're cured here. And it's generally an hour and a half or at most two and a half hours. And then so then I would say, let's take a little time. Let me empathize. Tell me your story. And I would not attempt to help the person during this 30 minutes. I would just repeat their words and acknowledge their feelings in a kindly way and say, wow, it sounds like you feel like you're really a failure and that you invested all this money, you had your hopes up, and then everything blew up on you, and now you're feeling kind of worthless and unlovable and guilty and ashamed. And my heart goes out to you. Tell me more of what that's like, and just let the person vent. And I call this the nothing technique, the zero technique, because I give the patient zero, nothing. In other words, I don't try to save them. I don't try to make an interpretation. I don't try to impress them. I give them nothing except what they're thinking and feeling and just reflecting it back in a kindly way. And patients really love that. And then after a while, I'll say, how am I doing here on empathy? Would you give me an A, a B, a C? And it's a little embarrassing to ask that question, because I'm afraid
you could get a C or D.
C or something, or a B. And usually they'll say you're getting an A or an A plus, but sometimes they'll say, well, you're getting like a B plus. And then I'll say, tell me the part that I'm missing. That happened actually. That's
great.
Yeah, and then you paraphrase that part. That happened to be in Philadelphia. I was doing a live demonstration at a workshop there about a week ago, and the woman said B plus, and then I said, well, tell me the part I'm missing. I can't remember what it was, but it was something very easy to summarize after she said it. And then she said, oh, now it's an A plus. So once I get to A or A plus, then I say, now, is there something here you want my help with? Or do you need more time to kind of talk and have me listen? Because that's really important too. And I don't want to jump in and try to fix you or before you're ready. And so usually the person will say, yeah, I do want some help. And then, like, say, the businessman that you're imagining, I would say, well, tell me what kind of help you would like. Suppose a miracle happens here tonight or today or whenever it is that we're meeting, and you walk out of today's session and say, that was like unbelievable. That was the greatest hour or 2 hours of my life. What would happen here? What would you be asking for? And generally the person will say something like, well, all these negative feelings and thoughts would disappear. My anger would disappear, my worthlessness and inadequacy and effectiveness would disappear, my depression, my shame, all these negative thoughts telling myself I'm a loser, I'm no good, I'm unlovable, people are going to look down on me because of this failure. This would all disappear. And then I say, well, we've got a magic button here. And if you press it, that'll all disappear in a flash with no effort, and you'll go into an instant state of euphoria. Would you press the magic button? And the person would say, oh, yeah, I'll press that magic button. And then I do what's called positive reframing, and that's one of the keys to this new team CBT. I say, before we press that magic button, maybe we better think twice. I've got some powerful tools here. I can't promise that miracle, but to tell you the truth, it could happen, and I predict that is going to happen in our session today. But before I could agree to do that, I think we better reconsider and take a look at what these negative thoughts and feelings show about you that's beautiful and awesome and positive, and also some incredible advantages and benefits to you in having these negative thoughts and feelings. And then the patient says, what are you talking about? What? I'm panicky, I'm anxious. And I'm beating up on myself all the time, and I'm depressed. How could there be anything positive in that? Can you think of anything? Are you still?
Yeah, I'm still. No, I'm sorry. No, I didn't. I can't think of anything.
We might start out with you're kind of very, very self-critical. You have a lot of negative thoughts about yourself. What does that show about you that's really positive?
That I'm self-aware.
Well, that's certainly a good thing. Is that a good thing, to be honest with yourself? Do you have a lot of flaws?
I do.
Well, is that a good thing, to be honest about your flaws?
Yes.
Let's put that down, number one on our list.
Okay. Right.
And also, do the self-critical thoughts, does it show that you have high standards?
Yes. I've got high
is that a good thing?
Yeah, standards are a good thing.
Okay, put down high standards. And have your high standards motivated you to accomplish a great deal in your life?
Yes, they have. I have accomplished a great deal.
Okay, that's certainly a good thing. And the fact that you're beating up on yourself, does this show that you're accountable, or that you're the kind of person who blames everyone else?
I take responsibility.
Is that a good thing?
That's a good thing.
Put that down. And all these negative thoughts. I'm a failure. It's all my fault. I screwed up. I caused the thing to go bankrupt. I thought it was a great idea, and it didn't sell. And this was my error. Does that show you to be a very arrogant person or a very humble person?
I feel very humble. Yeah, it's humility.
Humble.
Yeah.
Humility. Is that a good thing?
It's a good trait. Yes.
Yeah, put that down. And is that considered a spiritual quality?
It is.
So that's number 8 on our list. See, and we've just taken your first negative thought that I'm a failure, I'm no good, and we gotten 8 positives out of it. Wow. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But now let's look at your depression. You're very depressed. What does that show about you that's really beautiful and awesome?
I'm conscientious, maybe.
Well, are you conscientious?
I am.
Well, that's a good thing. Put that down.
Okay.
But what I had in mind is something a little different. Doesn't your depression show the passion that you have for life and for what you've lost?
It does. I feel very emotional.
Is that a good thing to have emotions and passion for life?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And another thing, so you can add those 2 things to your list. And another thing, would you say it's appropriate to feel sad and down after?
Given the circumstances, yes.
So put that down. Some depression and unhappiness is fine. Otherwise, you say, I just lost $10 million today, and I'm happy as can be. You see, it wouldn't make sense. It sounds nonsensical.
Okay, yeah.
So we keep going through every negative feeling and every negative thought. And see, the person's probably got 8 different kinds of negative feelings and probably 10 negative thoughts. And each one of them, we get 3 or 4 or 5 mind-blowing positives.
So now I'm kind of seeing where you're going. You're getting some positives out of what these negatives are. But at first I was concerned, like, well, wait a minute, would that solidify the fact that he should be depressed? But you're not. You're saying, hey, there's an appropriate level.
Like you're 90% depressed. What would be a healthy amount at the end of today's session if we could dial it down? Between 0 and 100, if we could put it at any level, what would be an appropriate amount of depression?
I'm thinking 10%.
Okay, let's put the 10. That sounds plenty. Now you're 100% anxious. And what would be an appropriate amount of anxiety between 0 and 100 at the end of the session?
5%, I think.
That sounds good. Now, you're 100% ashamed, you said. How much shame would you like?
I really like to dial that down. Maybe 5% too.
Great. We'll dial it down to 5 and go through every negative emotion like that. Do you see?
Yes.
And then I would say, now, I have to warn you, the techniques that we're going to use now are very powerful, and we could overshoot. and your anxiety might go down to zero. Your shame might go
That's
down
all right.
to zero.
That's quite all right.
But oh yeah, don't worry about it, because if it happens, I'll help you work them back up to these levels before the end of the session, so you don't end up too depression free. And then that's the end of what I call paradoxical agenda setting.
Paradoxical agenda setting. Yes.
And then we go in with the techniques like identify the distortions, externalization of voices. I have these 50 techniques for crushing negative thoughts, and generally takes at this point about 5 or 6 or 7 minutes to blow all the negative thoughts out of the water, because at this point then the patient is on my side and we're working together. And when that happens, then the treatment gets completed really, really quickly. And then that's the end of the therapy, and we've completed a single therapy session and a single course of psychotherapy in one session. It takes about 2 hours plus or minus 10 minutes.
So there's a lot of setup. It seems like the setup is kind of taking the air out of the balloons, these emotional balloons. It looks like that you're doing, right? In other words, you're not. Again, we're not doing the Pollyanna where we're just ignoring the fact and trying to rah be motivated, but you're saying, "Hey, you feel bad. Let's talk about that."
I make the patient proud of his or her symptoms. I become the voice of the patient's resistance. I speak in favor of the depression, the anger, the anxiety. The whole idea is to hang on to these things because they show something beautiful about you. My role is not the role of the healer, but the role of the patient's subconscious resistance. The patient has to do the cheerleading, not the therapist.
This is fantastic. So basically, for people listening, we would say to them, "Hey, if you're sad about something, that's okay. It may be appropriate to some degree to be sad. We're not trying." And
I'm going to try to put this in a new book I'm working on too, because this was the part that was missing from cognitive therapy and from my book Feeling Good. The book Feeling Good, the publisher said, "Why don't you rewrite it now that you've all this fantastic new techniques?" And I looked at it, and it's a beautiful book. It's tight. It's all intermeshed with a certain kind of thinking that's very helpful to depressed people. And the idea of revising it seemed impossible. It seemed to me easier just start over with an entirely new. It'll be a short book, but it'll show people how to incorporate these new techniques for really high speed recovery.
Oh, that's great. Are you writing it now, or is it written?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, no, I'm just started it last week, and
that's great. Yeah, I was gonna ask you. It was 1980 when I think Feeling Good came out, and then you did some revision in '99, I think.
That was just the psychopharmacology part.
Oh, okay.
That was like, it has 250 boring pages of antidepressant drug information, and I heroically updated all of that. It took a year. It was a nightmare. It was so boring. But that's what I did kind of as a service for the general public. But now the latest research is really showing that the antidepressants have few or no true antidepressant effects above and beyond their placebo effects. And so I won't even be including them in the new book.
Oh, wow. How about that? What is your opinion of meditation or like mindfulness?
If people like doing it, that's great. I don't like it myself. I don't find it pleasant or desirable or interesting, but most of my colleagues and students think it's really great and love doing it, so I cheer them on. But I think you need specific techniques to crush your negative thoughts, and meditation and exercise are what I call non-specific techniques, and they can be great to do, but if someone has OCD, or severe depression, I don't think you're going to be cured with exercise or meditation.
Yeah, I agree. I meditate, and what I find helpful is it gives me pause to notice the thoughts, or to I kind of step back and say, because we talked about this earlier about the automatic thoughts that come up so quick and you're not aware. So for me, it's been helpful. For me personally, I can't speak for others, just to be aware of what's going on in my head, and kind of get some distance, and then it helps me then to apply the techniques that I learned from you to dispute or realize they're silly, let them go,
That's right.
Yeah.
I have a neighbor who comes on the Sunday hikes. He's not a mental health professional, but he's just an interested neighbor, really neat guy named Dave, and he says the same thing. He meditates twice each day for 20 minutes. He says he gets a kind of separation from the thoughts, and they lose a lot of their credibility. So yeah, I mean, if it works for you, what a cool thing. But I'm more of an impatient type of guy. And for some reason, that kind of stuff doesn't. I think my life is my meditation. I think talking to you is a meditation.
So that's what I find when I talk to people, that when they really think about it and reflect, there is something in their life that is somewhat meditative, which means they're in some kind of flow. They've kind of let things go. It could be running. It could be conversation or just be out in nature, but there seems to be something that everybody doesn't realize maybe that they're practicing or doing that gets them into that. Are there any other books or apps or tools or any other techniques of that in this realm that we're talking of that you would recommend?
Well, I'm narcissistic, so I recommend my own stuff. But
I do too.
At feelinggood.com, I have the weekly Feeling Good podcasts that I do with a colleague, Fabrice Nye, and we've recorded about maybe 34 or 35, and we're actually doing live therapy on some of them, where I actually treat people.
Oh, really?
And we just did the first one of those. The treatment of Mark was a colleague, actually a fairly high-profile, very successful surgeon, he's a physician, but he was coming to my Tuesday group for years, and I was saying, why is this guy so interested in psychiatry? And he got real excited about these techniques I developed called the 5 Secrets of Effective Communication. And he actually formed a practice group with his buddies, and he comes dutifully to my Tuesday training group. And then he said that he would offer to be treated live on a podcast. And it turned out he had this belief that he was a failure as a father, that he'd been a very successful physician, but he could never get close to his 40-year-old son, and he was feeling very despondent over that. And so we treated him actually right here in this office about
on the podcast. It's on the podcast. Okay.
Right. And my colleague who teaches with me at Stanford, Dr. Jill Levitt, a clinical psychologist and a really fantastic, neat, smart person, was my co-therapist. And then again, he had a complete elimination of symptoms in one session. And so we broke it up into about 5 or 6 or 7 podcasts with commentaries. And so people can listen to that. And a lot of people have said your podcasts are having the same effect as your book, Feeling Good, that they listen to it and it actually caused their depression to disappear. So that would be a good resource. And then, any of my books, there's Feeling Good, the Feeling Good Handbook, 10 Days to Self-Esteem, Feeling Good Together. There's quite a number.
You wrote a book, Intimate Connections. At the time I was single, I remember, I probably shouldn't say this, but there's a technique in there that I used to kind of pick up and deal with women. It made me kind of a player.
Yes, exactly. For you, that was the goal of the book. They didn't know I was using psychology, but that was a great book. I can't remember. It dawned on me right before the podcast, and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. He has this. There was this other book, and I remember using it for. I think I'm embarrassed to say this, but I think it was. We probably shouldn't make love, right? I respect. It was there was some form of. That's right. Women are always using me for my body, and I want a real relationship. We can cuddle.
It was some kind of paradoxical thing that I played, and
it's very effective. That's neat.
So you were the first. You were the first kind of guy who wrote pickup psychology, but you didn't even know it. I don't think. It was something like that. But anyway,
Yeah, that's right.
Dr. Burns, this has been fantastic, and I would love to have you back on. And there's some of these podcasts I'm gonna jump on and listen to because they sound absolutely fascinating. I encourage everybody to go to his website feelinggood.com and check them out. And if you haven't read, those of you out there haven't read Feeling Good: The New Mood Therapy, it is still very, very, very relevant, and the techniques and are in there are fabulous, fantastic. I was kind of rereading it and recalling all of the information. There's so much there. It really is. We didn't even get to a lot of it. In fact, at the end, you talk about driving. The root causes or the beliefs that people have.
Yeah, right.
Because
that's cool stuff too.
And in the book you talk about feeling good, but then getting better. And the getting better is to examine your beliefs. The root causes.
Yeah,
so I might have to have you back on. Let's drill down into.
Well, I look forward to that. We'll schedule another one because it's been just absolutely enjoyable, and I'm very grateful to be on your show and to get to know you personally.
Dr. Burns, I want to thank you personally for helping me many, many years ago. This has been a joy just to talk with you. You were so kind and so easy to talk to. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Take care. You too.